Warning. This episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Give us 1 hour and we'll help you change the way you think about happiness. Harvesting Happiness with Lisa Cypers-Kamen is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. Each week, Lisa spotlights diverse trendsetters and change agents who are the greatest contemporary thinkers and doers, devoting their lives to creating a better world in which to live. Your host, Lisa Cypers-Kamen, is a widely recognized applied positive psychology expert, author, documentary filmmaker, and lecturer specializing in optimal lifestyle management. Let's get to it. Here's Lisa.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you are. Thanks for joining us on today's show, where you will learn about the desire for dopamine, understanding what drives addiction. My first guests are Dr. Daniel Z. Lieberman and Mike Long. Dr. Lieberman is a professor and vice chair for clinical affairs in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at George Washington University. He has provided insight on psychiatric issues for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Department of Commerce, and the Office of Drug and Alcohol Policy, and has discussed mental health interviews on CNN, C-SPAN, and PBS. And his writing partner and co-author is physicist Michael E. Long, who is an award-winning speechwriter, screenwriter, and playwright. A popular speaker and educator, Mr. Long has addressed audiences around the world, including a keynote at Oxford University. He teaches writing at Georgetown University, where he is a former director of writing. Mr. Long pursued undergraduate studies at Murray State University and graduate studies at Vanderbilt University. Guys, let's get to it. Let's talk about what this dopamine thing is.
Hey, thanks for having us, Lisa.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Come on.
Oh, it's so good to talk to somebody who's enthusiastic. We love it. It's the best, Lisa.
It is. It is. So what is dopamine and why are we so crazy for it?
You know, we called the book The Molecule of More because the role of dopamine is simply to get us more. This is the chemical that makes us look into the future and think about how can we maximize our future resources. It's a delicious chemical because it gives us optimism. It gives us the drive and the energy to say, tomorrow's going to be better than today, and I'm going to work hard to make it that way.
I think that it's worth mentioning, too, that dopamine does nothing less than divide the world for us, the way we perceive the world. There are things that we don't have and things that we do have. The things that we do have that we can appreciate with our senses that are within our immediate grasp, those are all appreciated through a range of neurotransmitters, of brain chemicals, and we call those the here and nows. Now, what's interesting is that when you're talking about something you don't have, something you want, the desire for more, all those chemicals relatively fall away and dopamine takes over. This is the single molecule in your brain that allows us to manipulate the abstract, to deal with what is not yet, with what might be. It gives us the desire to achieve, to move forward, to do the things that aren't in the immediate vicinity of our current moment.
So check in with us here for a second. When we talk about the pleasure center in the brain and the basic human drive for food, sex, the things that drive the average human being, and somebody who has tipped the scales from being sort of an average person into addiction where they're constantly craving more of that dopamine release, what's going on? What's going on under the human hood?
Well, the dopamine system evolved, obviously, to keep us alive, to keep us eating, reproducing, winning competitions, building tools, etc. And so it feels very, very good when we do these things, and in return, we get this dopamine stimulation. The problem comes when people engage in behaviors that stimulate that circuit too hard, and it becomes an obsessive focus of their life. And that's what drugs do. All drugs of abuse stimulate dopamine, and every drug that stimulates dopamine is liable to be abused. So what happens is that the bigger the burst of dopamine you get, the more important something seems. So, for example, if you get a 10% raise at work, that feels really good. But if you get a promotion that doubles your salary, that feels even better. And the dopamine release corresponds to the magnitude of the reward. Drugs, chemicals of abuse, are like a guided missile. It's a direct chemical blast to the system that really outweighs anything that nature is capable of giving us. And so it gives people this message, hey, nothing in your life, no promotion, no relationship, no nothing is more important than feeding your brain this drug of abuse because it gives you the biggest dopamine hit. And that's how these kinds of things can take over our lives.
What about love? I mean, there's nothing as juicy as being newly in love. Why is that?
Well, I believe one way to think about it is that love has two phases. It has the romantic phase, and then it has the companionate phase when you're actually enjoying being with somebody. At first, love is a world of possibilities. You see somebody across the room, you can imagine a great life with it. You can imagine anything you want with that person. The possibilities are endless. It's different from what you have now, and you can idealize it. And that's that dopamine burst. That's the hit. This could be wonderful. Now, as you get to know that person, the mystery surrounding them begins to fade. There's less new to learn until the time comes that you're not having a feeling of love based on the dopamine urge, the dopamine optimism of more. Now, what you know about them is all a matter of the senses, and the five senses, the way they feel, they look, they touch. And that's a different kind of feeling entirely. You have to appreciate it versus anticipate it. Early love, anticipating what might be. Later love, appreciating what is. This is why so many people chase love, fall in love, move to the next one, because all they can do is anticipate love, and actually being a companion is too much for them. For instance, George Costanza.
Talk a little bit about him.
Well, George, if you remember Seinfeld, to me, he's everybody's other personality, I think. George constantly wanted to find a woman to make his life complete. He would meet a woman, he would pursue her, and as soon as she liked him back, as soon as the chase was over, boom, George Costanza was no longer interested. All he wanted was pursuit. He was incapable of engaging in a companionate relationship. So much so that when he fell in love and got engaged, he wanted to be unengaged as soon as possible. And when his fiance, if you remember, his fiance died from licking the glue off of envelopes, and the glue was poison, he wasn't heartbroken. He was thrilled because now he was free. It was so black and dark. He was free to once again pursue the love he didn't know, the love he didn't have. That was the thing that George was best at. And for so many of us, that's what love is. It's on to the next one, on to the next one. That's why love doesn't last very long for some people. As soon as the mystery is gone, the companionate part is a requirement that we can't quite pull off.
I once interviewed anthropologist Helen Fisher, and she was talking about the human brain newly in love and on cocaine, that in an fMRI, both looked similar. The brains lit up similarly.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Love is a powerful trigger for dopamine. And as Mike was pointing out, in some ways, it's about anticipation. If I could just bring Winnie the Pooh in for a moment, there is a scene in the House of Pooh Corner where Christopher Robin asks him, what do you like best in all the world? And Winnie the Pooh is about to say honey, but then it occurs to him, there's this moment just before you eat the honey that's better than eating the honey itself. And that's dopamine. It's anticipation. It's expecting something wonderful. And in a way, that's also love. It's a kind of love that Helen Fisher has called passionate love. And as Mike pointed out, a lot of it is imaginary. This person that we're passionately in love with, in some ways, isn't a real person. They're an idealized person that exists only in our head. And that phase of love lasts for about 12 months. But after that point, you start to have to engage with the real person. And for those of us who have been in a longer-term relationship, we know what that's like. It's a mixed bag. There's no longer that dopaminergic euphoria but it shifts from this constant state of longing and driven excitement to ideally a state of quiet satisfaction, fulfillment. And Helen Fisher refers to that as the companionate phase of love. And that's driven by different chemicals. The one that most people are familiar with is oxytocin. It very much helps you focus on what you have in this relationship and not what might be better with a different relationship.
Beautifully said. Talk a little bit about how dopamine works in terms of domination, winning, conquering.
Well, there are a number of different dopamine pathways that go through the brain. We've been talking about a pathway that in the book we call the desire pathway. That's the one that makes us want things, and that's the one that makes us high when we are anticipating getting something important. But there's another pathway as well, and that's a pathway that leads up to the frontal lobes. It's a part of your brain that is relatively new in evolutionary terms, and it gives us some of the higher processing power that sets humans apart from other animals. Both of these pathways are about looking forward into the future, to maximizing future resources, but the time course is different. With the desire pathway, it's pretty much, I want it now. That's what goes off when you see a donut,
Scratch
when
the
itch. You see a sexy person across the room. But the other pathway, the control pathway, is really one of a longer term view. And it's less interested in things like donuts and sex and more interested in long-term gain, such as honor and promotions and wealth. And that's the one that's more going to help us dominate our environment. It's going to look around, look at the resources that are available now, look at the resources that are going to require planning and work, and put together a sequence of events that is going to maximize what a person can get.
So when you talk about the frontal lobe, are you talking about the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that governs reason, accountability, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, exactly. And this pathway is the pathway that is not working properly in people with ADHD. And that's why they tend to be impulsive, going after short-term things. They have difficulty planning long-term. And that's why we treat them with medications like Adderall and Ritalin that boost dopamine in their brain.
Let me ask you a question about that for 1 second, because I would say a good 70% of the clients that I see in my practice, in my addiction recovery practice, have ADD or ADHD or were diagnosed when they were younger. And they gravitated towards whatever their drugs of choice or behaviors of choice became as a result of trying to manage their condition.
Yeah. And, early on, people with ADHD are very vulnerable to addictions because this circuit that tells them, hey, this might not be such a good idea for your long-term success. You need to resist this temptation. That circuit's not working very well. And so the short-term desire circuit tends to work unopposed. Early on, there were some concerns. Do we really want to give these people who are very vulnerable to addiction things like amphetamines?
Yeah.
And, right? It sounds kind of crazy on the surface.
Yeah. But
good, well-designed studies have shown unambiguously, yes, we do want to do it, because strengthening this longer-term control circuit far outweighs any problems people have with the medication itself. And in fact, what they found was that the earlier you give it to them in terms of how old the patient is, and the higher you dose it, all of those things push down the risk of addiction. A little bit counterintuitive, but that's what the data says.
We're going to jump off to a break, and when we come back, we're going to continue the conversation with Dr. Daniel Z. Lieberman and Michael E. Long. We're talking about their newest book, The Molecule of More, How a Single Molecule in Your Brain Drives Love, Sex, and Creativity, and will determine the fate of the human race. We're going to come right back and continue the conversation. To learn more, please visit moleculeofmore.com, on Twitter at Molecule of More, on Facebook, Molecule of More, and we're hashtagging Molecule of More. We are going to jump off for a quick break. We'll be right back, and that is a promise.
To learn more about cultivating sustainable well-being at home and the office, visit harvestinghappiness.com. and explore Lisa's experiential on-site brain fitness workshops, corporate programming, and speaking engagement services.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us now, we are talking about the desire for dopamine, understanding what drives addiction. Let's return to the conversation with my guests, Dr. Daniel Z. Lieberman and Mike Long. All right, guys, let's jump back into the conversation and talk about the role of dopamine in both creativity and madness.
Well, let's talk a little about creativity. And I think the best place to start when you think about creativity is to define what it is you actually mean by creativity. And we have a definition we like, and it's pretty good, I think. And that is that being creative is associating things that don't normally go together. If you think about some of the most creative things, or things we'll call creative, that people enjoy, they fit that definition. Someone like Brian Wilson, for instance, of the Beach Boys. Do you like Brian Wilson? Well, if you do, you probably noticed that his famous record Pet Sounds has things that go together only on Pet Sounds. Who else would use a theremin, that spooky sound, you know? From who else would use a theremin in a record along with bleating goats and fire engine sirens? Who would do that sort of thing? We appreciate a mismatch, if you will. And one of the things that we see in creativity is just that, connecting things that don't belong together. Now, if you think about mental illness, one of the things that defines mental illness is the inability to stop connecting things that don't go together. Sort of what psychiatrists call a word salad, for instance, is an example. A roar of words coming out of the mouth of a person with mental illness that don't go together. You can begin to see, if you think about that mental illness is a lot like creativity. And in fact, a creative brain is more like a mentally ill brain than a normal brain. Why? Because the difference is one of degree. People who are creative actually they don't have so many associations between things that they can't control them, can't make something out of them. Mentally ill people, on the other hand, are so overwhelmed with connections that they can't conduct their lives in a normal way. And dopamine is behind that. Dopamine is let me let Dan jump in here. I've been talking for a while about creativity. I'll pass it on to Dan and let him handle the chemical side.
One of the things that people do when they have a very highly active dopamine system, which does characterize both creative people and people who suffer from certain psychiatric illnesses, is that they tend to be novelty seeking. That is, they get bored very easily with the same old, same old. They always want something new, something unexpected, something that they can anticipate. So they go through life with their eyes very, very wide open. And that makes them able to make these creative connections. One of the most famous creative acts in history was the Eureka moment, when it was discovered that the displacement of water gave you a sense of volume. When Archimedes sat in the tub, saw it overflow, and ran around Athens naked, screaming, "Eureka, I found it." He had sat in a bath dozens and dozens of times before, but this time he noticed something he'd never noticed before. And that's what high levels of dopamine can make you do. And it can be a wonderful thing when it leads to creative insight, but it can also be very difficult because it makes it hard to pay attention to the ordinary stuff. And that's why we sometimes think of artists as being almost like helpless children when it comes to everyday life. Their head is in the clouds. They're obsessed with finding something new. And so they don't comb their hair. They put on 2 different color socks, and their room is an absolute mess. When it gets to be so severe that it turns into a mental illness, people slip into a world of unreality, where they're no longer looking for new things in their environment, but their brain begins to produce phantoms that fulfill the need for new things. And we start to see paranoia and even delusions.
You can also see here, Lisa, why a lot of people who are highly creative, highly accomplished, turn out to be real jerks.
No. Really?
They are, as Dan put it, they have their head in the clouds. Their dopamine is the active system. Their H and N's, the here and nows, the things that are around them, not so much. And so they don't prioritize how they treat other people, how they interact with other people, what other people think about them. It's all about the abstract. In fact, if you look at the accounts of Socrates not being a jerk, simply shutting down, standing in place for, as it's recorded, days at a time, just caught up in the abstract, caught up in the future, caught up in his own thoughts. It's easy to imagine how someone so caught up in possibility would simply mistreat the people around them.
Sounds a little familiar.
I hope not, but it could be.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about just in our social climate today. It's a familiar scent.
It is. People who have highly dopaminergic brains tend to be very focused on achieving goals. And sometimes they will justify trampling on other people's feelings, trampling on other people's rights, because with dopamine, you can sometimes say the end justifies the means, just because dopamine is so focused on maximizing these future resources that it may neglect some of the niceties of everyday social interaction.
So for us humans who are dopamine crazy, what is the solution? How can we learn to balance our dopamine and find other ways of releasing, or constructive ways of releasing, these chemicals in our brains to make us feel balanced, happy, and most alive?
Well, it's important to remember that dopamine is in the future. Dopamine is about things that we want but don't yet have. And it's important to balance that with an appreciation of what we do have. And let me give you an example of somebody who doesn't do that. Think of somebody who plans a visit to, let's say, Italy, and they're so excited about visiting the Vatican and gazing at all the beautiful art. So they get to the Vatican, they're standing in front of this art, and their mind is wandering. They're thinking about where they're going to go for dinner. Or more prosaically, you feel like you'd really love to have an ice cream cone, and you're all excited about getting it, but as soon as you're eating it, once again, your mind is wandering. You're thinking about what's next rather than thinking about the tastes and textures of that beautiful ice cream. So in order to balance ourselves out, in order to make ourselves not so obsessed with dopamine, we've got to learn to spend some time in the present. And of course, a lot of people have been saying that. We hear lots and lots about mindfulness. Don't always think about what's next. Try to pay attention to the sights, the sounds, the experiences of right here, right now, because that can give so many benefits. It can give us serenity, it can give us peace, satisfaction, and just get us off that treadmill of constantly seeking more.
Yeah.
If I can just jump in, Lisa, I love this example. I'm going to share it. One way that creativity presents itself outside of art is achievement in business, because that does take seeing, for instance, an area of the marketplace that hasn't been addressed or hasn't been addressed in an efficient way. A lot of people who are highly successful with all the money that comes with it aren't very good at enjoying their money. And here's what I mean. Have you ever noticed that the person most likely to be able to afford a beautiful house right there on the beach is often the person least likely to go out there and sit in the Adirondack chair and wiggle his toes or her toes in the sand? The people
Yes.
The people who
Yes.
the people who have earned it can't enjoy it, and they're off to earn the next thing. In the same way Dan talked about a trip, and that has obviously that's to their detriment, and there are ways around it. But there's also something sadly positive about it, and that is this shows how clearly dopamine is the engine of human progress. It makes us not want, it doesn't make us want the thing itself. It just makes us want more, something new. So instead of sitting in the Adirondack chair, that guy gets up and thinks about how to start a new business, because that's what gives him the enjoyment. That's what gives him the pleasure. So the inability to enjoy, which we certainly do want to overcome to the extent we can, is also part of the key to why we have so much, why other people who aren't quite as dopaminergic get to enjoy so much. This is what drives us into the future, the dissatisfaction with now.
Very, very well said. And I do know those kinds that you're describing. I had a husband once, and he said to me, I live near the ocean. He says, how can you sleep at night? It's so noisy here. So there you have it, right? And we're as two different people motivated by very different things. So I do get what you're saying, but that now thing about finding some level of equanimity in the now, I think is what many of us are seeking today.
Yeah, we have a choice. We're not slaves to dopamine after all, but it is hard work to switch over to the here and nows.
And there's so much that tempts us not to do it. So much of technology and social media and all of these wonderful services that are, you might say, being offered to us for free. You might say being shoved down our throat. They're constantly telling us, hey, there's a little bit of dopamine just 1 second away on your cell phone or on your computer. See if somebody liked your post. See if there's an interesting news story. And I think it becomes harder and harder to just say, I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to look at nature. I'm going to focus on the person in front of me. I'm going to live in the present moment. Because those kinds of things don't generate revenue for companies. At least we haven't shifted to the part where we learn how to generate revenue from that so that we can make it something we promote in our culture. But for now, it's all about more is where the money is. And so those are the kinds of forces that are working against us.
And it's got to be said from every forum that we can have, for sure, because not everybody agrees. This is your choice. You are not at the mercy of societal forces. They may be something to battle, but that's not the end of the game. If you choose to focus on the now, you can, but you must decide and you must work at it. It's not enough to say, I'm at the mercy of my cell phone. I'm at the mercy of the media. You're not. But if you choose to be, you are.
But here's the thing with dopamine and my understanding of how it works. And Dan, as the doctor, please jump in and correct me, that once that part of the brain, that pleasure center, is activated and recognizes that dopamine reward is coming, it wants more and more and more to the point where that choice mechanism becomes flawed.
It's true. And, at this point, I think we're even getting into the realm of philosophy when we talk about free will. Because I think that things like drugs of abuse and other things that powerfully trigger dopamine, perhaps even social media, impair our free will.
Yeah.
It never takes it away completely, but it makes it harder and harder to say no. And that's where healthcare professionals can come in, because healthcare professionals can push on the other side and say, look, there's these forces lined up against you, pushing you to make bad decisions. We can bring forces to bear on the other side to balance things and let you ultimately decide where you're going to take your life.
Well said. We are out of time. Will you guys come back and hang out? I feel like there's so much more we could talk about in this realm. I mean, there's so many directions, and we just sort of scratched the surface. The book we're talking about today is The Molecule of More, How a Single Molecule in Your Brain Drives Love, Sex, and Creativity, and will determine the fate of the human race. That's the book. The authors are my guests today, Dr. Daniel Z. Lieberman and Michael E. Long. To learn more, visit moleculeofmore.com, on Twitter at Molecule of More, Facebook Molecule of More, and hashtag it at Molecule of More. We're going to take a quick pause and we'll be right back. That is a promise.
Did you know that happiness is actually good for your health? Happy people live longer, are more productive, and make better partners, parents, and professionals. Connect with us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness and follow Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen for a daily dose of inspiration.
And we're back, continuing that conversation about the desire for dopamine, understanding what drives addiction. My next guest is Travis Lupick. Travis Lupick is an award-winning journalist based in Vancouver's downtown East Side. He works as a staff reporter for the Georgia Straight newspaper and has also written about drug addiction, harm reduction, and mental health for the Toronto Star and Al Jazeera English, among other outlets. For his reporting on Canada's opioid crisis, Lupick received the Canadian Association of Journalists' prestigious Don McGillivray Award for Best Overall Investigative Report of 2016 and 2 2017 Jack Webster Awards for Excellence in BC Journalism. Welcome, Travis. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for such a kind introduction.
Well, the work that you're doing, I think, is stellar, and it needs to be reported. We are looking at not just an epidemic in the United States and in Canada, but around the world. And you and I spoke briefly before we started our conversation on the air about everybody knows an addict, and you so appropriately stated, and everybody knows somebody who's now died of addiction.
Yeah, I report on a daily basis for the newspaper here in Vancouver on what Vancouver's come to call the fentanyl crisis. And we noticed that barrier broke down a couple of years ago now. Before it was everybody knew somebody who had passed away. And now it's sadly everybody knows somebody who has passed away.
So it's no longer 6 degrees of separation. It's more like 1 or 2.
It's really not. I mean, in Vancouver, people in the United States might be more familiar with Philadelphia, for example. Adjusted for population, our overdose deaths are about on par with Philadelphia, 50 per 100,000, which is a horrifying number. And that degree of separation has been broken down. At this point, everybody knows somebody who has passed away and been affected by this.
You state an interesting fact in the book. There were 64,000 fatal overdoses across the United States in 2016, which is up from just 15,000 20 years prior. That is huge.
It's frightening. It eclipses deaths from car accidents. I mean, in Canada, similar statistics vastly eclipse deaths from guns, homicides. In both countries now, the number one cause of death for people under 50 is a drug overdose. The number one cause of death. It's a really scary problem that's developed.
Frightening, and many people don't realize it. That, we think of drug addiction and drug overdoses as something that's happening in the streets with just children, and that is the case. But also we're seeing older adults experiencing the same addiction crisis and subsequent overdoses.
There's absolutely no stereotype for the victim that this overdose epidemic is claiming. A good journalist friend of mine with the CBC, Canada's NPR, his uncle, who's a prestigious lawyer in British Columbia, passed away recently. And my reporter friend has been covering the fentanyl crisis alongside me and found him writing a story about his own uncle.
Wow. And when we talk about the fentanyl crisis and the addiction epidemic, we're really talking about a very human condition that unites all of us in that we want to eliminate our suffering. I think there's a misunderstanding about the soul or the personality of an addict.
I've interviewed hundreds of people who use drugs and who became addicted to drugs. And the addiction is never the root problem. The addiction is a symptom. The root problem is pain. So often people using illegal drugs like heroin are self-medicating, whether that's a physical ailment and the first drugs they received were prescribed in a doctor's office, or whether that's an emotional element, childhood trauma, and they sought heroin on the street to deal with that childhood trauma. The root causes of this drug epidemic are things like depression, pain.
And none of us wants that, whether we're using a drug or not. Talk about what makes Vancouver unique, because British Columbia, I think that you guys up there are leaps and bounds ahead of us down here in terms of how we manage addiction.
We do some things right, we do some things wrong, but we do a lot of things right, especially where harm reduction is concerned. In 2003, Vancouver established North America's first supervised injection facility, Insight, and that really solidified our reputation as a leader on harm reduction. And since fentanyl arrived in, say, 2011, 12, 13, the harm reduction debate has sort of been reignited in Vancouver, and we've since taken a lot of steps beyond Insight. We've flooded the streets with naloxone. That's the so-called overdose antidote that reverses the effects of an opiate. Naloxone is free and over the counter in Vancouver, and you see little clips strapped to people's belts all over the city. I'm really not exaggerating. You see it walking down the street all the time. Since the winter of 2016, in downtown Vancouver, we've opened up more than a half a dozen what we now call overdose prevention sites, which are sort of like mini strip-down injection sites. So we're doing a lot of things right. We've taken harm reduction certainly further than any other jurisdiction in North America now. But fentanyl is a really tricky problem, and sadly, the deaths have not declined.
And when you talk about harm reduction in the use of naloxone or Narcan, which is, I believe, is what it's called down here,
right,
you guys are way ahead of the curve. Here, it's not readily available. It's costly. There's a stigma if you do have it on you. And I think that nobody should have to die of an overdose, right? If you are helping somebody to live and you give them services, and, Gabor Mate writes a lot about this, right? Give somebody a sense of community and purpose and to be part of something, then you're really on the road to really treating what is underlying the illness or the diagnosis of addiction.
I think what you're saying, I think what it really comes down to is just treating drug users like human beings. If somebody is addicted to heroin and is using that heroin to self-medicate pain, they shouldn't have to do that in an alley where they're injecting something into their body using puddle water and looking over their corner, afraid of police persecution. They should have access to a safe room like the rooms at Insight, where they have clean water, where it's a nurse looking over them instead of a police officer. I think that's just about treating people like human beings.
And seeing the suffering. In the work I do with clients, and a lot of the clients are heroin users. Some of them have come to us as the result of an overdose, and fentanyl being part of the equation sometimes if they're lucky to survive. And when they see that they can be loved and cared for and looked after, when they might not necessarily be able to possess that for themselves in the beginning, therein lies the opportunity for the shift.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's a big piece of harm reduction that's often not discussed. It is not harm reduction's primary goal to shoot people into the treatment system. Harm reduction approaches people without judgment, without motive, and says, here's whatever help you need. But an unintended consequence, if you will, is that a lot of people do find treatment through harm reduction. At Vancouver's Insight facility, there are registered nurses who will happily connect anybody injecting drugs at Insight to a detox facility or to a treatment facility. There's actually a detox facility directly above Insight called Onsite. While it's not the primary goal of harm reduction, a lot of people do find treatment through harm reduction.
Well, I think people find connection when they come for harm reduction.
That's a really excellent word for it. That's all this is. Instead of forcing people to use drugs in an alley, they can use drugs in an environment where they feel safe, where they establish connection.
Most addicts that I have spoken with, and I've been doing this a long time, they will all say at some point they will come to the end of a run. Even though they may love the drug, they realize its destructive force. And the challenge becomes not getting off the drug, but staying off the drug, because the way that we treat people who are afflicted by addiction is not a sustainable model, right? It's really easy to get somebody off their drug of choice. It's really hard to keep them off it.
Yeah, what I think we need to do is create a more caring environment for people who are trying to get off of drugs. I understand why drugs are illegal. I get the logic. I understand the logic of sending police officers after drug users. But when you really begin to think about that situation, it doesn't make sense. By sending police officers after drug users, you create stress and anxiety and fear. And those are emotions that drive people to drugs, not away from them. Conversely, an environment like Insight, where there's a caring nurse, rubbing your shoulders and saying, I'm here for you, that's a really comforting environment where people will feel less inclined to use drugs.
I agree. We're going to go to a break in a minute. And before we do, I want to give our listeners your contact information. We're talking with Travis Lupick about his book, Fighting for Space, How a Group of Drug Users Transformed One City's Struggle with Addiction. To learn more, please visit www.fightingforspace.com. On Twitter, he is at @Lupick, and that's Lupick. And on Facebook, the handle is the same, T. Lupick. And when we come back, Travis, I want to talk about something that Vancouver has done that is very unique in its supply of housing to this population. So hang with me and we'll come back and we'll carry on the conversation. We are going to take a quick pause. We'll be back in just a minute.
Who says money can't buy happiness? Whether you are a skeptic or seeker, check out Lisa's new book. Are we happy yet? 8 Keys to Unlocking a Joyful Life. A boot camp manual for greater emotional fitness is available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, IndieBound, and HarvestingHappiness.com. Here's a truth bomb. Emotions are contagious, and happiness is a universally desired state. But we tend to forget that we all have the freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable each day, regardless of external circumstances. Explore the journey of human happiness, how to find it and keep it, with Lisa's documentary film, H Factor. Where is your heart? Visit harvestinghappiness.com to learn more.
And we're back. Travis Lupick and I are continuing the conversation about the desire for dopamine, understanding what drives addiction. Let's get back to the discussion. So, Travis, prior to the break, you were talking about harm reduction in the city of Vancouver. I'd love to talk about housing because Vancouver has done something unique, what I consider to be a model in providing housing and medical services to those who are challenged by addiction.
Yeah, this is really the story that I tell in Fighting for Space. It begins in a rough part of Vancouver called the Downtown East Side in the year 1990, when a very young nurse named Liz Evans arrived in this neighborhood when she was just 25 years old and was given a contract to provide mental health services in a real beat-up old hotel here called the Portland. And Liz started doing this really, really simple but really revolutionary thing. She took people in off the streets and she said, "You live here now. You will always live here now. You will not be evicted for using drugs. You will not be evicted if your mental health situation is destructive or disruptive. You live here now." And again, it had this really interesting unintended consequence. She discovered that when people were given a home without condition, they used drugs less. They had less mental health outbursts. That anxiety of eviction was removed, and it began to address all these other problems. So 20 years later, we started calling this Housing First. Your listeners can look it up. It has a Wikipedia page, Housing First. But in the early 1990s, long before that term was used, Liz Evans was doing this in hotels in Vancouver.
When you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, and, viewing the needs as a human being as a pyramid, the basic need of all of us is shelter, food and shelter. And if you do not have food and shelter, it's pretty hard for you to be effective in any other area of your life.
And we don't make housing easy for drug users.
Right.
So many supportive housing projects across North America will evict you if you're caught with drugs. And if you're truly addicted, if you have a physical dependence on drugs, the added anxiety and fear that must create, that you are not even stable in your housing situation, that you can be kicked to the streets at any time, that creates a relentless added anxiety on people that very likely pushes a lot of people to more drug use. It's very counterintuitive.
Well, I think the whole problem is very counterintuitive. We want to institutionalize the problem, medicalize the problem, and really what we're talking about are human hearts and minds that require something else in order to help them heal.
Too often, our approach to drug use and our policies around drug users are based on morals as opposed to science or even logic. I understand that drug use is wrong, and we don't want to create such a friendly environment for drug use. But the environment that we're creating around drug users is one that only pushes them to greater drug use. It does not actually address what they're feeling, why they're using drugs. It does not help them stop.
Well, dealing with mental health, for example, if we stigmatize mental health, then people are less apt to seek it out, or perhaps it's not even available to them, that in their healthcare system, or they might lack availability of healthcare. This is their way out of handling mental health.
Yeah, both in the United States and in Canada, we make it actually exceptionally difficult for people to obtain mental health services. Systems are siloed, people are pushed from one building to the next. And then when they take care of themselves, unfortunately, sometimes through drug use, we persecute them and we incarcerate them. It's a very unfair system.
It's unfair and it doesn't work. I often say to my clients, and their eyes light up when I say it, I'm like, you walk into facilities like these knowing exactly what to do in order to be addiction free. You're bright. Every single person that I come in contact with, for the most part, is intelligent. They already know. Their disconnect comes from the brain being hijacked by the substances, and the inability to make the decisions, to self-regulate, to manage the triggers and cravings is at the root of the mechanics of the addiction, right? So there are two sides, right? There's the mechanics, the neuroscience of what goes on in the brain, and then there's the very human heart aspect of it, of a hurting heart.
Yeah, and that sounds complicated because it is complicated. Addiction is a tricky thing to treat because you have to address all the different aspects that you just described. And so we have to make extra effort to give people the time and the strength to address all of that. And one way Vancouver is doing that now, and this will sound controversial, but in Vancouver is increasingly giving prescription opiates to people who are addicted, giving a drug called hydromorphone, brand name Dilaudid, or at one facility in Vancouver, even giving people prescription heroin at Crosstown Clinic in Vancouver 3 times a day. There's a select number of about 100 patients who can receive prescription heroin. And while that will sound radical, what's happened at this clinic, what I've watched happen at this clinic, is its patients are removed from the hustle of a daily addiction and are given time to work on that complex problem that you just described.
Yeah. Though that is amazing. I was unaware of that project of the prescription heroin, but it does make sense because you're talking about a long-term treatment protocol. 30 days doesn't do it, 90 days doesn't do it. Maybe after 2 years, somebody's brain has begun to heal enough that they really have a chance at licking this thing. This is hard.
Yeah, Crosstown Clinic's prescription heroin program is a multi-year program for long-time entrenched addicts. But I've followed so many of these clients for almost 5 years now, and the changes I've seen in them over the past 5 years are just amazing. Many of them have lowered their dose. Many of them have transitioned from an injection therapy to an oral therapy. And many of them I've seen return to the workforce. I know more than several of these patients who are working plus 30 hours a week.
That's really interesting, because I think that you've given back their dignity by doing this.
Yeah, you've returned them to society. They're still maintaining an addiction. That's a problem that still needs to be solved down the line. But you're no longer criminalizing them. You're no longer pushing them into alleys. They're a member of society again. They have housing. They're contributing again. And all of that makes them feel better, and that allows them to use less drugs.
What does the population of Vancouver and British Columbia think of this? I mean, because to me, this is an absolute stellar model. But the average person, if you were to walk up to them on the street who is not connected to this part of the world, what would they say? Are they in favor of this?
Well, that's an interesting question because I'm a journalist and I write for the daily papers here. And of course, writing for daily papers, you always try to include both sides of a story. In Vancouver, there is only one side to this story at this point. I don't really have anyone to go to for a voice against an injection facility or even a voice against this prescription heroin program we're talking about. But that's because Vancouver's been having this conversation for a long time. We've been talking about harm reduction in a real serious way and about injection sites since the mid-1990s now. So, we've had 20 years to talk it through. So I really understand how this stuff can sound radical and scary to jurisdictions that haven't had that 20-year conversation. And what I'm really hoping we can do with the book, Fighting for Space, is help other jurisdictions who are now just starting that conversation have a more informed conversation.
Well, it's one that we need to be having down here in cities across the country because we have a huge problem on our hands. There are not enough people who are educated in terms of how to really deal with these challenges because you have sort of the medical side of it. You do X, Y, and Z, then here's your result. And then you have the mental health side where it's saying, you need to get into the underlying issues, the childhood trauma and all of those things. And that's all well and good. But in the meantime, a whole lot of people are going to be dying if we don't do something.
Yeah, Vancouver's fentanyl problem is North America's fentanyl problem. Lately, I've been spending a lot of time talking with folks in Philadelphia and Boston, New York, cities where I'm taking Fighting for Space next month. And there are people, though, that are dying to have this conversation in those cities. And it really has started up. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio said he's talking about injection sites now. Philadelphia again, Boston. The conversation is happening.
And oftentimes at these injection sites, you have staff who are working there who are so good and so supportive that you have patients or clients or visitors asking for help, as you mentioned when we were talking earlier, that they come to the determination on their own. They need help. They need a change. They can't sustain the model.
Yeah, it's sort of a piece of harm reduction that does not receive enough attention. Very often, harm reduction facilities are a gateway to treatment facilities. People go there to use drugs or go there to obtain a clean needle. But while they're there, they have the opportunity to bump into a nurse. And maybe while they're there, they think, maybe it's time I ask for a little help. And so what these facilities do is give them a place to ask that question.
Well, and I have heard of unofficial harm reduction sites, that there are restrooms in downtown Los Angeles, for example, where Narcan is available. You can be assisted, you can get clean needles, and the staff is equipped to help funnel you to legitimate, safe treatment if you so choose. And it's not really widely publicized, but it's there in some places.
Yeah, that's happening in New York, too. I saw a piece on CNN about a similar situation where it's bathrooms that people are going to for security because there's somebody connected to that bathroom who will check in on them if an overdose occurs there. This stuff is happening. Unfortunately, in so many jurisdictions, it's happening underground without any sort of government support. In a lot of jurisdictions in the United States, it's still really controversial to put tax dollar money behind this. So volunteers have taken this mission on. Volunteers are responding on their own dime, on their own hours to the overdose epidemic. And that's amazing. It really is so inspirational. But it also should not be the case. These programs should be run by the government.
I agree. And as a mom, I have 2 young adult children myself. When I look at clients that come in for treatment, I think that's somebody's child. And if that were my child that was in the care of somebody else, how would I want them to be treated? So I think if we approach the problem with more love, kindness, empathy, compassion, and care, and see ourselves as our brother's keeper, which I know might be controversial to say, but if you're doing well and the person next to you is doing well, then that rubs off on me, then I'm going to do better,
That's an interesting point because mothers played a huge role in the conversation around insight that Vancouver had in the early 2000s. And it was mothers who went on the radio, talk radio programs and television and said, my son is addicted to drugs and I want an injection site in Vancouver so that if I can't find him in the middle of the night, I have somewhere to look and he has somewhere to, or she has somewhere to be safe. And again, responding to fentanyl, mothers across Canada are playing a really strong advocacy role for harm reduction in this conversation.
Well, power to the mamas,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, we're noisy, I think with good reason. We want our children and everybody's children to be safe and have the opportunity to lead a good and happy life. And at least the possibility, the opportunity, for somebody to get help and then make those decisions once they're more stable. We've run out of time. Travis Lupick, come back and hang out with me. This is such an important topic and I want to give more air to it. It's critical to our well-being. To learn more about Travis's work and the book, Fighting for Space, How a Group of Drug Users Transformed One City's Struggle with Addiction, please visit www.fightingforspace.com. On Twitter, Travis Lupick can be found at @TLupick, and on Facebook, T. Lupick as well. Travis, thank you so much. Please come back.
Thank you so much for having me. Anytime.
Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers-Kamen and my guests, Dr. Daniel Z. Lieberman, Mike Long, and Travis Lupick, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Go out and rock your day, and remember to stay safe.
Keep harvesting your own happiness anytime and anywhere, from the comfort of wherever you are. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes via our free app or from our libraries at toginet.com, iTunes, Google Play, and other fine podcast platforms. To learn more about Lisa's global consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Spread more joy by liking us on Facebook at Harvesting Happiness and following Lisa on Twitter at Lisa Kamen. Harvesting Happiness is produced in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU Radio Malibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.